We're 3 minutes into the hour, and inshallah we can get started. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. And welcome to this month's Ummatics Colloquium. So my name is Dr. Salman al Azami. I'm a departmental lecturer at the University of Oxford, and it's my honor to serve as your moderator today for today's colloquium. The theme of today's gathering is both timely and exigent. The title of today's session is Media Forming and Undermining Ummatic Sentiment. In an era where media landscapes, or the media landscape is as variegated as it is influential, we really have a duty to critically examine its role in shaping the collective Muslim identity. The media's power to both unite and divide is unparalleled, and its impact on the Ummah is a subject that warrants our collective scholarly attention. We shall particularly focus in today's session on the insidious role of Islamophobia in modern media discourses. The media's portrayal of Islamic terms and concepts, which are integral to our collective identity, often serves to delegitimize these terms and concepts. This, in turn, undermines our attempts at fostering ummatic solidarity, a cornerstone of Islamic and social thought, and indeed the raison d'etre of the Ummatics Institute. We're privileged with us today to have an esteemed panel of experts who will delve into these issues with both rigor and nuance, as they are deserving. I'll just briefly introduce our three panelists and then outline the format for today's session. So the first of our panelists is Dr. Salman al Azami. We happen to share a last name because he is actually my uncle. Dr. Salman al Azami is a senior lecturer in language, media, and communication at Liverpool Hope University. His work critically engages with the intersection of language and media, particularly as it pertains to Muslim communities. He has been a vocal critic of media practices that marginalize Muslim voices, thereby making him an invaluable contributor to today's discussion. Of particular relevance to this discussion is his editorship of a forthcoming volume entitled Media Language on Islam and Muslims, Terminologies and Their Effects, which will be coming out next month with Palgrave Macmillan. Our second panelist is Dr. Mohamad Elmasry. Professor Masri serves as Professor of Media Studies at the Doha Institute. His scholarship focuses on the media's role in shaping public opinion and policy, especially in the Arab world. He's been a veteran of developments within the media and observing these developments over the course of the last decade and a half. Dr. Elmasry's insights into the media landscape of predominantly Muslim countries will offer a unique perspective to our colloquium, and we're privileged to have him zoom in from Qatar, from Doha, Qatar. And finally, we have, last but not least, Dr. Michael Munnik, a senior lecturer in social science theories and methods at Cardiff University. And correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but you're also closely affiliated with the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK, which is a centre I have the privilege of being on the advisory board for. Dr. Munnik's research delves into the complexities of media representation and its impacts on community dynamics. His expertise in social science methodologies will provide a comprehensive lens through which to examine today's themes. In the interest of full disclosure, both myself and Michael have contributed to my uncle's forthcoming volume on the media. So the format of today's session will be that each of our speakers will be given 15 minutes to present their prepared remarks on the theme. And I will allow you to do that in turn, so that will take a total of roughly 45 minutes. And then I will give each speaker about 5 minutes to reflect on or respond to or share any thoughts they may have had on the remarks of the other speakers. And so hopefully in an hour's time, we'll be ready to open the floor to any questions and interactions with guests and attendees. I'm really looking forward to, inshallah, stimulating and enlightening discussion. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us tawfiq. So without further ado, may I ask Dr. Salman al Azami to take the floor for the next 15 minutes.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, thank you to Ummatics for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. And thank you, Usama, for the introduction. And assalamu alaikum, everyone who are watching and who will be watching later. So I just in my brief discussion, I'd like to give a sort of a background of the book that which is coming up, and the Ummatic aspect of the book, and how we hope that this book will contribute, and then focus on a particular chapter of my book about the chapter my book is on Allahuakbar, and how that is such an important aspect of our ummah and the Islamophobic representation of it. So I've been working on religion in the media for the last 10 years, and particularly on Muslims in the media. I have a previous monograph published a few years ago titled Religion in the Media, Linguistic Analysis, where I looked at how the three Abrahamic faiths are represented in the British media in terms of the language used to represent them. After that, I've been working on Islamophobia in the media, particularly the language of Islamophobia in the media. My background is language and linguistics. I'm a social linguist, and I also specialize in media representation. So I did organize a few events and did some work, but I was thinking that particularly, you can say that there are two aspects of research that I particularly feel that it was important to involve the community. One is, of course, academically in the UK. I don't know how much it is in the United States, but in the UK, a very important aspect of our research is we call impact, how our research impacts the real people in the world. And secondly, of course, as I am working on Islamophobia in the media, the recipient of Islamophobia in the media are the communities. So what impact does my work, or potentially my work, could have on this aspect? So I observed that the Muslim Council of Britain, which I have had communications with them previously as well, but I've observed that they developed a Center for Media Monitoring, and they started working on how media misrepresents Islam and the impact that has on the Muslim community. And so I started working with them and started helping them as an advisor to the Center for Media Monitoring. And talking to Migdad Versi, who is the spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Media, we agreed that actually they were coming up with a media style guide on language or terminologies on Islam and Muslims that the British media use. And this came about after Migdad Versi's communication with the leading media editors and news editors in major media organizations. And they said that the language that they use, they don't have much guidance of how to use it and what impacts the Muslim community. So they decided to develop a sort of style guide, like a writer type style guide for the media. And here we came to the understanding that an academic book on some of the major terminologies that will feature in that media style guide will be a useful contribution, or can say academic evidence to the guidance that they are developing. So in that way, we have partnered, and in our book, each of the terminologies that we have covered in the book, the media style guide recommendations have been added. So we are looking at, in our book, around 10 terminologies, including Sharia, Jihad, Islamophobia itself, Taqiyya, Islamic State, which is Michael's contribution, then moderate and radical Muslims, which is Usama's contribution, and my own chapter is on Allahuakbar. And this is where I want to focus in the next few minutes in terms of why this is such an important issue. Because what I did in my research is I spoke with different communities, and how an expression, a phrase a Muslim uses, a particularly practicing Muslim uses many times a day, how that has become a byword for terrorism. So the media representations often represent Allahuakbar as a slogan, before which, I mean, that they say Allahuakbar and then detonate a bomb. Very interestingly, which is also features in my chapter, one of the biggest shopping centers in the UK, the Trafford Centre, which is in Manchester, did a simulation exercise about a terrorist attack. So how will they counter a terrorist attack if there's a terrorist attack takes place, a bomb explosion takes place in the Trafford Centre? In that particular simulation exercise, they started with Allahu Akbar, and then a bomb detonated. So that was an exercise. And later on, of course, they were severely criticized and they apologized for that. But it has gone to that level that it's not even media. Greater Manchester Police did this exercise and they used that. So, and one of my participants actually a few years ago took part in a Channel 4 documentary in which the documentary was non-Muslims spending some time with Muslims in a Muslim household. And when that non-Muslim came to her house and she said Allahu Akbar in her prayers, the guest, non-Muslim guest asked, isn't that what they use before bombing? So this is the impact of Allahu Akbar on the non-Muslim or the great, the Western world, general public. And we can't follow them because they actually don't know. How many of them have exposure to Muslims and they know that Allahu Akbar is it's not only deeply spiritual aspect of Muslim life, but it's in every aspect of a Muslim life. When a child is born, we say Allahu Akbar, we did the adhan to a child. When we are happy, we say Allahu Akbar. When even something sad happens, we say Allahu Akbar. Or just without any reason, we say Allahu Akbar. So how come that has become a byword for terrorism? So I decided to analyze a few media articles on how Allahu Akbar is represented using critical discourse analysis analytical model. And then I sent these same articles to a few members of the Muslim community. So I did 3 focus groups, a group of Islamic scholars and imams. Another group was young Muslim students, they are university students. And another group was professionals, Muslim professionals. And I wanted to get their reaction as a community, as part of the Ummah, what they feel about it. What is their reaction to the way Allahu Akbar is represented in the media, and particularly in light of the representations I analyzed, but also their own experience. And there are 2 very important things came up, and that is, I think, needs wider thinking of particularly Muslims living in the West, is that the fear of using it in public. So our audience or my participants overwhelmingly said that they do not very consciously never use Allahu Akbar in a public place in Britain, in fear of being looked down upon, or people might doubt them, people might show fear. And one of my participants, I remember saying that I used to be more carefree before, but when I have children and I go with my children, I never say that because it might have an adverse effect. In other, of course, we never use it when you go on the airplane because they might be taken out of it. But a very important aspect of where I want to particularly end and focus on, and want to have more further discussion on this, hopefully, is we need to reclaim it. And that is, this terminology is ours as Muslims. And it cannot be just let the media dictate what this terminology means, what Allahuakbar means. So the overwhelming majority of our of my audience or my focus group participants said that we want to reclaim the term. And actually the title of my chapter is Reclaiming Allahuakbar from Media Misrepresentations. So how do we reclaim? And that is an important thing for us to think about and perhaps focus on. So there were some interesting points coming out. And one of the things is that we have to try to make it, normalize it. How do we engage with the non-Muslim, our non-Muslim neighbors and colleagues and friends and public in general? How do we engage and let them know that this is a term that is normal? For example, there was discussion of there are other common terminologies that Muslims use, like inshallah, masha'Allah, alhamdulillah, which don't have much of a problem. But Allahuakbar has the problem. Yes, it is true that there have been terrorist attacks where some terrorists have used this phrase and done something terrible. But that doesn't mean that they own it. So we need to reclaim it. And the process of reclaim could be that we engage in mainstream media as much as possible. We produce media products. So one of the things that I think we Muslims do lack a lot is that we are not active in the media. I mean, we are not active in, particularly in popular media, in popular culture, in fiction, in writing novels, making films, and these are the things. And if you compare, if you look at, I'm talking about the Western perspective. If you look at some of the productions coming out from Turkey, particularly a couple which I think many of the audiences will know about, like the Derilis Ertuğrul or Kurulus Osman series, where they use Allahuakbar very, very strongly. And it has widespread audience around the world, including many non-Muslims. So this is a very important media, but of course, in mainstream British media, we don't see these types of programs. What we do see is fiction where a Muslim is using Allahuakbar and making an attack. Programs like Homeland, programs like Bodyguard in BBC, programs like 24, all these types of very popular and also spooks, which used to be in the early 2010s. There was a BBC thriller, thriller series, spooks. In all these, Muslims are represented as terrorists, and Allahuakbar is used as a terrorist slogan. So this is where I feel that my own focus group participants, which came out that, and also in my observation, that this is something we need to think about and think how we can reclaim the term. And one important aspect of this is academics like us, or those who work on Islam and Muslims and media representations, we engage with the community, our Muslim community. One of the questions that was there is, how do we, as Muslims, counter Islamophobia in the media? And that is something I have been thinking about as perhaps my next project is about community engagement. And that because in the Muslim world, we generally always do firefighting. We react. We are very reactive rather than being proactive. So how can we be proactive in nullifying the effects of Islamophobia in the media? And one of the ways is can be reclaiming words, these types of terminologies, or jihad or Sharia. Why are they feared about these terms? Islamic State, which I think Michael will, I'm sure, will discuss because this is his chapter, and that why is Islamic State our media, they say, oh, that is what the translation of their how Daesh used to call themselves, or they call themselves, whereas they do use Boko Haram and use other terms for the terrorists in Nigeria. So this is something that I think we have to have a proactive thinking in terms of how to counter it and how to proactively come up with productions in popular culture, in media, in all other different forms of media, to give a proper representation and reclaim all the terminologies that are integral part of Islam and Muslims, but are misrepresented both by terrorists and by the media. So I hope this opens up for more discussion, and later on, of course, I'll be happy to answer questions and take part in more discussions. Thank you very much.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Salman. Thank you so much also for keeping to time. So I am, you might notice, sort of just sending discrete messages in the chat to the panelists. And so please do keep an eye on that. And without further ado, I'm going to, there's plenty to discuss in what you've just said, and I think it's extremely valuable, but just in the interest of time, we'll leave that to the discussion stage. So I'll move swiftly on to Professor Mohamad. If you could kindly share your reflections on the theme.
Sure, I'm making note of the time, and inshallah I won't go over. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. I want to thank Ummatics, and it's really an honor for me to be taking part in this colloquium and to be a part of such a prestigious panel. So let me say a few things about kind of what we know about Muslim representations or representations of Muslims in the news media. I do want to focus my bit on the news media. I will try to say something about some research that I've had the chance to carry out, in part because it's that which I'm most familiar, but also because I think it's relevant to the discussion, and it limits the opportunity or the chance of overlap. I don't want to say anything that has been already said by my co-presenters. So briefly, and this is a huge area. There's a massive scholarly literature about Muslim representations of Muslims and Islam in Western media representations or Western media coverage, and then also some studies on coverage in the Muslim majority world. So, and there's no time to go through all of them, obviously, but I want to give some highlights on maybe some of the big data studies that we have, because I think they're insightful. So there was a recent study done, and I think this gives us some idea of the scale of the problem, right? There was a recent study done that examined 850,000 articles published in 17 American newspapers over a 20-year period. So this is a big data study. Obviously they're using computerized content analysis programs, and they're comparing Muslims with Hindus, Jews, and Catholics. And what they find, and it won't surprise anyone watching, was that Muslims are covered more negatively than any of the other religious groups. What's interesting about this study, couple of things. First of all, the negative tone holds over time. So what some people say about changes or improvements being made over time, may not be accurate. We don't have empirical evidence for that. That's one thing that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that the negative tone about Muslims and Islam holds even when events are controlled for. Because one of the things that people say is that, well, the reason why there's a negative tone surrounding stories about Muslims or Islam is because there are terrorist attacks, or there are wars or violence or things of that nature. But the negative tone holds even when those sorts of events are controlled for. Now, there was also a meta-analysis published recently on 15 years of studies on American news portrayals of Muslims. So this is another, there's a lot of data in this study. It's a meta-analysis is basically a study of studies, right? So they're examining more than 300 published works on this topic. and they're finding the same thing, that Muslims are portrayed stereotypically and negatively, right? There's very little difference. Oftentimes in academic literature, you have findings, but then you have sort of counter findings. There's very little of that. There's very little of that going on. Now, what I want to highlight here, and I think this is important. I mean, Dr. Osama in his introduction talked about the insidiousness of media discourse about Islam and Muslims. What I think is maybe most insidious, and what the research tells us, is that Muslims and Islam are not really talked about in Western news media unless something bad is happening. Unless there's bad news, unless there's some tragedy, there's a war, there's a violent attack of some sort, right? And media scholars and framing scholars working in psychology and political science and sociology and other disciplines talk about the importance of association. And association is critical. We have to ask ourselves, what are the implications of news consumers only hearing about Islam or Muslims when something bad is happening, right? I think we can all sort of surmise, in part based on some of what we know from the framing literature, which I would be happy to speak to if there's time in the Q&A. The other question that I like to ask myself is what are the ramifications of the typical American or other Western news consumer really never seeing or rarely seeing positive portrayals of Islam or Muslims, or even ordinary neutral portrayals of Islam or Muslims, or never getting the chance to see Muslims in a sympathetic light, to see Muslims as victims, right? That's a major question that I think we have to ask ourselves. And my co-researcher and I, we've done some work on this idea of victimhood or victimness. And what we've done in some of our recent studies is we've looked at terrorist attacks that have targeted Muslims on the one hand and non-Muslims on the other hand, and how they've been talked about in elite American newspapers. We actually did 2 studies that looked at 5 different terrorist attacks. I don't have time to go through all the data, but the long and the short of it is that major American newspapers, number one, are not terribly interested when Muslims are the victims of terrorism. They are quite interested when non-Muslims are the victims of terrorism. Now, we selected our events very strategically. We've controlled for as many of the confounding variables as we could have. And I think the results kind of speak for themselves. The disparities are pretty massive just in terms of the sheer amount of coverage. But what's maybe more interesting is the way news articles frame these terrorist attacks and the victims. And again, I don't have time to go through all the data, but quickly, non-Muslim victims are much more likely to be humanized. We're measuring something called humanization in our studies. So non-Muslim victims are humanized. Muslim victims are not humanized, not nearly to the same degree. Also, and this was interesting, attacks against Muslims are not framed as acts of terrorism to begin with, which is fascinating because the attacks that we selected all meet the textbook definitions of terrorism. Of course, the attacks against non-Muslims are framed as acts of terrorism. So this is something that I think is interesting and relevant. I want to say something, especially because, in light of what's happening today in Palestine, I do want to say something about the research into Western news reportage of the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think that's significant, and I do think it's relevant to this notion of Islamophobia and also to the Ummatic sentiment, because the Israel-Palestine conflict is not just, and I mentioned this in a talk that I gave recently at Georgetown, it's not just a political issue, it's also one of Muslim identity, right? At least in part, right? And also the Israel-Palestine conflict has historically been fertile grounds for Islamophobic discourse, whether political discourse and media discourse. And what we find if we look at that literature, and here again, there's a large body of literature, is that Israelis are humanized, Palestinians are not. Israeli violence against Palestinians is repeatedly and consistently legitimated, oftentimes described as retaliatory or being carried out in self-defense, whereas Palestinian violence is almost exclusively described as a brutal, wanton aggression carried out for no apparent reason. This is what study after study has found. I actually did a study looking exclusively at death, acts of violence carried out either by Palestinians or by Israelis, and the differences are quite staggering. And I'd be happy to speak to them if there's time during the Q&A. Let me say something briefly about Muslim majority representations of Islam and Muslims. There's not as much research here, but recently scholars have started to look into this. I've done a little bit of work on Egypt, and there is quite, an aggressive sort of anti-Muslim, certainly anti-Muslim religiosity discourse in Egyptian political and media circles, whether we're talking about political discourse, news media discourse, or entertainment media discourse. My co-researcher and I also just published a study in the International Journal of Communication looking at Emirati newspaper coverage of Palestinians, which showed some evidence of anti-Palestinian discourse, especially after the normalization agreement of 2020 was signed. Actually, the numbers, I'm probably understating things. The numbers are actually quite staggering. There was basically an overnight shift in Al Bayan's editorial policy following the signing of the normalization agreement, right? So we go from a lot of discussions of Israeli violence and Israeli oppression of Palestinians, numerous references to the occupation. There were actually precisely 3.02 mentions per article on average of the occupation. This is all prior to the normalization agreement. After the normalization agreement, and we looked at 2 full months of coverage, there's almost no discussion of Israeli oppression or violence, and there were precisely 0 mentions of the occupation in 2 months of coverage in this daily Emirati newspaper, Al Bayan. So that's another sort of example. Now, if there's time in the Q&A, we can speak to framing theory and what that might tell us about kind of the impact of these messages on not just non-Muslims, but also on Muslims and notions of Muslim identity. But I want to say something quickly about the spiral of silence theory, which is interesting. I think I have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and then I'll close with maybe just some recommendations. So the spiral of silence is fascinating. It's a theory developed by Elizabeth Noel Neumann, which assumes that people's willingness to speak out publicly on moral issues, political issues, ethical issues, even religious issues, depends on their perceptions of majority opinion. So in other words, people are constantly surveying the public opinion scene to evaluate where their own views lie, right? And if someone realizes that their opinion or their viewpoint is in the minority, they are more likely to stay silent, you see. Whereas people who are in the majority or who think they're in the majority are more likely to speak out on issues. They're more likely to self-identify and chime in with their opinions, right? And then there have been hundreds of these studies. So this is a very robust theory. And one of the things that I think is important to remember is that Muslims are sort of constantly marginalized. Muslims, and not just Muslims, but the notions of Muslim religiosity are marginalized. They're pushed off to the side. And so you can imagine then the implication of the spiral of silence effect. Over time, people that are quiet become even quieter until there is essentially a complete silence. There's also something interesting to be said about cultivation theory, which if there's time, maybe in the Q&A, we can talk about that. But it's a theory that says that over time, people that watch a lot of television, and now they've applied it to other media types as well, but at its core, it's a TV theory, but people who watch a lot of television have their perceptions of reality quite literally altered by what they're seeing, especially if narratives are repeated over and over again, if they're consistent. And we do have some research on Islam and Muslims, and basically no one will be surprised that negative views of Arabs and Muslims are influenced largely by television portrayals. I think I have about 30 seconds left, and I'll just wrap up by saying I want to echo what Dr. Salman said, and maybe rephrase things in the form of advice. And my advice to Muslims is that we need to take a much more active role in constructing the narrative about ourselves and about our religious tradition. At present, we do not have much control over media production, certainly not in Western societies. We do not have much participation in journalism or in media advocacy, certainly not in entertainment media, nor in media relations or public relations. And so in some ways, it's not terribly surprising that media patterns are what they are. And I will stop there.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Mohamad. That's really sort of, I think, very important food for thought. And again, I'm going to move on swiftly, but I just wanted to add that both you and Dr. Salman kind of have highlighted a series of challenges, various kind of ways in which current structures are systemically geared towards marginalizing Muslim voices. And I think both of you've kind of alluded towards the conclusion of your remarks, the importance of the Muslims or the Muslim community adopting a proactive rather than a reactive approach. And one of the major concerns of the Ummatics Institute, and this I hope can speak to all of your papers and in the discussion, is to think about what it is that we can do proactively to construct that sense of Muslim solidarity on the global scale. Salman Sayyid, among others, has commented how if all the Muslims work together, they would make up, the largest single population collective of any collective group in the world, that should mean something. Right now, it doesn't really, and so that's a context which I hope we will really interrogate. What can we do to change this situation over the course of the Q&A? I've taken a bit of time from you, Dr. Michael, but you've got 5 minutes. 15 minutes. So please take it from here for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to set up my watch so I can kind of keep an eye on my own time as I go. And it's not behaving very nicely for me, but that's all right. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Thank you to the Ummatics Institute for convening it and for everyone who's coming and joining to listen to the discussion. And my thanks also to Dr. Salman, who edited the volume that my chapter is part of, and for approaching me on this. A good place to start, I guess, is that when he mentioned about his work with the Muslim Council of Britain in terms of putting together the idea of a style guide for journalists on the importance of the terminologies in a Muslim context. I was one of the scholars that was invited to be a part of the early discussions about that. And so it's an idea that he and I have been working at for a couple of years now and thinking about this in different ways. When we got some feedback and a question that was going through my mind in an earlier proposal on some grant funding for exploring this, was the question about what good a guide will do for journalistic practice. And this is probably a good point to introduce my background, which, although I'm currently as a senior lecturer and working in the academic industry here at Cardiff University, in my former career iteration, I worked as a journalist. I was trained, my first degree as a journalist in Canada at Carleton University in Ottawa, and I worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the public broadcaster there, for 8 years prior to transitioning into higher education. So my interest in the topic, my reflections on it, are very much informed from journalistic practice. And I can see some of the distinctions that already happened for me in my own professional career from a trainee journalist being initially socialized into the field and working in the field as a journalist itself. We were required to adhere to Canadian press style when we were doing our traineeship, and there was a very small book called CP Caps and Spelling that we needed to adhere very strictly to, with capitalization, spellings, word usage, at the point where if we veered from that in our assessments, we got a 0 on them. So it's very hard bath, if you will. But it was meant to get us knowing that journalists take accuracy and consistency seriously. That was the message that we were given. And so it will perhaps be interesting for the audience when thinking about how Muslims are reported on when questions about accuracy and consistency are misused, to think, well, why does that happen if your professional habitus is that of cleaving to these norms, which were rigorously instilled in us at trainees, and then seeing what slippages might happen, what slippages didn't happen out in the professional space. But guides existing on the floor but not being so well consulted was an interest of mine, and I found that as a working journalist I relied less and less on the guides as I was working more, because you feel that you intuitively understand what journalism is expecting of you and you know how to go about and proceed with things. When we had problems, areas at the limits of our knowledge, we would often be referring to past news stories, or we were calling up people that we knew who had knowledge, maybe not to use them as a quoted source in our public finished product as a journalist, but to give us clarification, context on the issues that we're interested in, which then depends on the robustness of your networks and the accuracy of past journalistic coverage of an issue, which is not always to be taken as a given that it will be as accurate as we'd like it to be. And so on the back of that initial question about this proposal of a guide for journalists, I did do a small study funded through funding at Cardiff University with a student researcher, looking at existing style guides that are available to journalists in the UK and what they say or don't say about Islam and Muslims. And we did some analysis of that, and the results of that are published in an article that just came out this summer. So the July issue for this year of the Journal of Religion, Media and Digital Culture has those findings. It's even open access, so you don't need to be subscribing to that particular journal to look at that. But that starts to talk about what's already in the case for the tools that journalists have for them, something of a distinction between in-house news guides and style guides that were devised by external groups. And we might class this one that the Muslim Council of Britain is working on as one of those guides. Distinctions in terms of the usefulness of that, the thoroughness of them, the extent to which they covered certain topics, and the advice that they gave for journalists. What we imagine might be useful for journalists if they were in some difficulty covering an area that they just don't have much knowledge about. So that is, there are some deficiencies. There were some strong points coming out of it. It's not all doom and gloom. And if I can then refer to the work that I did for my doctorate when I was studying at the University of Edinburgh, which was to look at relations between journalists and sources from Muslim communities to understand, again, that question about where those relationships are struck and how that influences the knowledge of journalists and what they're reporting on. In interviews with journalists, there was a sense of some knowledge. Dr. Salman mentioned about Allahuakbar as a particularly difficult term that is often misused, and wanting to reclaim that. I did note in my interviews that on other key terms, and I'll put to fatwa as an example of this, where we have a common understanding with the Muslim community that fatwa means a death sentence. And it's related to a very particular and high profile case regarding Salman Rushdie, the novelist in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And how that seeped into journalistic discourse where they don't understand the issues and the word in its full context. And so how the word gets used to become a dangerous term. But that and actually, a U.S. scholar called John Volte has written very well about this, and looking at especially the Associated Press, its style guide and news language there about the word fatwa. But when I spoke to journalists, they were giving me some sophisticated knowledge about that there was a term that they knew didn't just mean a death sentence. And they were at pains to demonstrate this to me during our interviews. There was a sense that they wanted to show themselves to be responsible, doing the right thing, having learned from problems of the past. And certainly, when we think about the studies that we've been hearing about just in this colloquium, we know that those problems haven't gone away. But I am interested to see about that maturing of journalistic discourse through contact, through discussion, and maybe through the presence and work of Muslims in the industry, acting, being available as sources, which is something that I'm interested in and published about, but also where I'm interested in moving with my research towards working in the news media field. Those are the things we can pick up a bit more, as I say, in the discussion that will follow this. But in the last time that I have, let me look at the chapter that I contributed to the volume before us, which was dealing with a particular term, Islamic State. And it was not Islamic with a capital I and then state with a lowercase s, as you might imagine, a more general sense of how the Islamic State is represented in news media, but specifically the group Islamic State, which has multiple names translated into English, and the group itself has changed its name over the rise, and eventually I don't think they've changed it after the fall of their fortunes, but there was definitely a progress of it in their own internal communications and how they self-presented, and how then the journalistic industry, as well as other facets of society, adopted that term or didn't. We can see from, we know from a broader linguistic coverage about the particularities of the word Islamic as an adjective, the way that it lends religious authenticity and power to the word that it's describing. And for a non-Muslim audience encountering that, there is that feeling then that Islamic something becomes kind of part and parcel of the tradition, how it understands things. And there's a feeling, if you don't have strong knowledge of it, of the accuracy and the correctness of that it's characterizing something that I should understand. So Islamic terrorism is already a problem if we think about that phrase, because it conveys a sense that there's something, intrinsic to the religion that permits this, that makes it authorized and okay, which is what makes then people who are at the receiving end of it or at the observing periphery feel that it's somehow permissible and right to call out. So when the group Islamic State positions itself such and adopts that name, journalists have a choice whether they adopt that name or not. And one thing that the style guide that the Muslim Council of Britain is coming up with makes quite clear is that the choice is not an automatic one. Just because a group presents its name, it doesn't mean you need to take it. It's because a group wants to see itself translationally in a particular way, doesn't mean that needs to be done. So there are choices for journalists when faced with a group that pretends to the claim of being the Islamic State or an Islamic State. And by adopting that, even with its earlier geographic limitations, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Shams, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, Greater Syria, we often turn sometimes as well in news coverage, or the ISIL version, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, that is seen to be authorizing that. And even if journalists are critical of the group and not wanting to support it, that nonetheless by using that terminology, they are perceived to be giving them the credibility and legitimacy they need to continue their work. And so you had think tanks, state actors criticizing the media for using this language, saying that they were unwitting participants and supporters of this group. And that positions the media industry on one side of a conflict or a quarrel, saying you're with them if you use this term. But on the other hand, by inducing them to change that term, they are trying to draft them onto their side of that disagreement, that conflict, and say, you need to work with us and support us. So I mentioned public broadcasters, and there's a difference between a public broadcaster and a state broadcaster. Certainly an independent private news media organization ostensibly is beholden to neither. And so there were some tears in that, because the journalists want to throw their hands up and say, we have no responsibility for one side or the other, we just call it like it is, which is a convenient and perhaps a typical journalistic posture to take in that side, that we don't want to be supporters of the government necessarily, although in some cases they did want to be seen as that if there was a worry about well-being, and we need to be more sophisticated with our look at news media, because which news media organization starts to matter for whether they were happy to align themselves to state interests or wanted to remain aloof from state interests and critical and, in a journalistic sense, objective and above it all. But then taking that language on may nonetheless give support to a group they would also not want to be seen as supporting. So just recognizing in my analysis that the choice of terminology is never idle, and it always comes with consequences, though journalists may not always want to adopt it and acknowledge those consequences. But there is some good scholarship about it, which we can discuss further depending on where the conversation takes us on this regard. So when I did my analysis, I'm not typically a content analyst. I look more at journalistic practice. I look more qualitative research and how things come about. And so for me, what was interesting to me was to identify the traces within news coverage of the moments of decision making, where journalists were confronted with the choice to adopt this name or not, and when they were feeling pressure to use names in a particular way, what they did about it. So the first moment was in I'm going to get my notes handy, but it was the moment in June 2014, late June, when the Islamic State declared itself not any particular geographic limitation, but said, we are the Islamic State, and this is how you refer to us. And at that point, there was a lot of dissensus among the media organizations in Britain about the terms to use. There was no consistency in the period prior to that, although they were certainly writing lots of stories about it. We saw terminology changing even within one particular news organization from story to story. The Guardian would have very different terms they would use, even with the same correspondent journalist writing at different times. Confronted with the challenge then of this group's self-declaration, do they adopt that phrasing? Do they take it on board or don't they? So I looked then 18 months on from that. The next node in my point was, it began kind of at the point of the attacks in Paris at the Bataclan. And then from that, British-UK parliamentary debate about whether to authorize airstrikes in Syria in the face of this and to act forcefully against this group. And at that point, there was discussion as part of the parliamentary debate about the terms that they would be using. And here, the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, and the Conservative Party was insisting that we should not use the word IS, Islamic State, or any of these, but we should use the word Daesh, and there were various reasons offered for that, and very directly compelling the news media, as well as members of his own party and members of the opposition, to use this term. So we had journalists drawn into it, and that was the most important moment for seeing journalists sort of evidence that they're working out, showing that discussion based and looking at what their competitors were doing and thinking about why they would use this term or not. And then finally, 18 months on from that, what terms the journalists used then. And just to briefly sum up that where there was dissensus and variety in that first period that I examined, in that second period in January of 2015, could be getting my dates incorrect on here. But that second period around the debate of the airstrikes, there was a real consistency in how the journalists used it. Islamic State was the preferred term. And the word Daesh came up because politicians were using it. But then if we look 18 months ahead, they were not adopting that term any more strongly than before. So they had not been moved or persuaded by the language of the politicians, calling directly on news media to change their language, bringing in some of the reasons that are significant for this conversation about ummatic solidarity, not doing harm. So journalists showing their independence at that point from these other social institutions and actors in saying, this is the term that we as a group are using and we insist on it. But that knowing that that is not a necessary term they needed to use, and their justifications for doing so can be scratched and pulled apart through a bit of critical discussion, but also acknowledging, as I said, that to do so carries with it consequences equal to that of bending to the pressure of the state and adopting the language that state actors wishes to use. So that's what my chapter is about, and hopefully that will be significant for the conversation here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Munnik, for really keeping perfectly to time again. I mean, all of you've been very good sports in that regard, and I really appreciate it. It makes my job much easier. So let me perhaps open the floor to the wide, we're opening up to wider discussion. In a moment, we will welcome people's questions, and I can see that questions have actually been filtering in the Q&A sort of window. So please do feel free. Participants are welcome to put in their questions, and we will address them to the extent that we can. And what tends to happen in a lot of these discussions is that, you know, people get their questions going later on, and if you come towards this, towards the end of the session, there's less of a chance of getting your question answered. So I just maybe wanted to take this opportunity to reflect a little on the remarks that have been presented by our three presenters, to whom I'm very grateful for their contributions. And in some respects, bring it back sharply into focus on the sort of topic at hand, which is media forming and undermining ummatic sentiment. And I think we've done a lot to think about media undermining ummatic sentiment, but the forming part, I think, is where we're going to have to really maybe knock our heads together and think about exactly what can we get our media to do. You've all, in a sense, highlighted the various challenges that Muslims face and the need to be more proactive in generating their own sort of discursive content. But one of the concerns that I want to perhaps briefly express, and I'd love to hear your pushback against, is Toni Morrison's reflection, the great American novelist and writer, reflections on the nature of racism. And she famously describes racism as a distraction. I've got the quote in front of me. I'll try and read through it rather quickly because it's long. The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And I think the challenge that we face, those of us who, and I'm as guilty of this as any of us, my chapter is very much on Islamophobia, and the way in which radical and moderate and those terms are used to perpetuate a reality, is that are we getting caught up in the distraction, and are we sort of stopping ourselves, or do we need to invest more in the strategy of construction? So deconstructing Islamophobia is, I think, important, very necessary. We've all become very good at it, I think, within scholarship and academia, those of us who are in this arena. But what can we do to actually create that alternative? And I think that's the sort of question that Ummatics is the Ummatics Institute is trying to force upon us as academics and scholars. What can we actually do? And perhaps I can propose 2 points of, perhaps points of contention, but points of reflection methodologically that we need to think about. One is what social scientists call methodological nationalism. This is defined by some social scientists as the assumption that the nation or the state is the natural social and political form of the modern world. We're speaking whether in terms of Canadian or British or Egyptian or various nation states as the core units within which we operate, and the de facto reality is those are the powers that operate, that run the show, and that's the assumption on which the international system works. But that is arguably one of the reasons why Muslims can be divided up into various nation states and then picked off individually, because they're all weak when they're separate. And the other one I want to suggest is perhaps less directly relevant, but still relevant, is methodological secularism. I don't know if this is used widely. So methodological nationalism is the assumption that nationalism as an ideological framework is normal. I'm also suggesting that secularism as an ideological framework for scholarly analysis is normal. And this presupposes that actually religion coming into the political space is somehow problematic. It's not, a lot of scholars spend time trying to problematize that perspective, but it's just so ubiquitous in our culture that it's very difficult to overcome. And I think it needs to be, both of these sort of stances need to be systemically attacked, to put it sort of like somewhat starkly. And then we can think about matters ummatically without being looked at sideways, shall we say. So I just wanted to put that forward as a preliminary reflection, but I also wanted to give each of you perhaps 5 minutes or so to share any further reflections that you may have had on listening to the other 2 speakers And so can I start maybe with Dr. Salman? And we will get to this. If you want to stay less than 5 minutes, please feel free, because we will have the opportunity to have more discussion as the questions come in, and they've come in quite thick and fast now. So Dr. Salman, please, up to 5 minutes of reflection.
Thank you, and thank you to my co-presenters. To be honest, I completely agree with what they were trying to say, and particularly Dr. Mohamad Elmasry's comment on the media framing element of it. So how and that links with your question about the distraction. Is media framing something and we are being distracted by it? Is that a correlation between the two? And how do we, as a community or ummah, respond? In terms of, I'll come back to your distraction element. Focus on more on this, because I feel that we need to separate elements of. That's why I was talking about reaction and being reactive and proactive. So when we criticize media and engage with, analyze media, and of course, as academics, our job is to analyze and then come out with findings. But if we stop there, I feel that is more of a distraction. But if we try to engage with the community and try to, pass on the message, of course, it is not our job as academics to be community leaders. Well, it's great if we can be, but it will be difficult. We can't be, jack of all trades. I feel that as academics, our responsibility is to highlight the issues and show the community, the ummah, that these are the things we feel coming out from our empirical research, that things need to be done. And of course, give advice and support and guidance in whatever way we can. But then it has to be, the mantle has to be taken up by the community leaders, as an ummah, not nation state, because that is I do talk about in my lectures language and nationalism, which is a very interesting area of talking about nation states, and why you talk about different countries in the Arab world, for example. How the Qatar was sort of divorced from the Arab world and then brought back. So the nation state element of these things, which divides us, and in terms of, because we are not thinking that it's like a body, that if any part of our body is hurt, the whole of us, the whole existence of us feel hurt. And that is something I feel that a proactive take on, for example, the narrative that we were talking about. What is Islam? What is Muslims? Are Muslims a sort of a separate, type of being coming from this, alien world, who come here and say Allahuakbar and kill people? Or they are like flesh and blood, like any of us, with good things, good people, with bad people. Most people are neutral, normal, going on with their everyday lives, whether they live in Iraq or whether they live in Afghanistan or whether they live in Britain or America. So, and how do we reflect that in our narrative in terms of popular culture? I again want to emphasize that, because that is why we were discussing that people watch. You cannot stop people watching TV. You cannot stop people watching Netflix. You cannot stop people going to the theater. But what you can do is try to give a counter narrative, or I would not say counter, but alternative narrative, to say that, well, this is us, not what other people want to tell you that. In a realistic way, in a believable, and in a way that people find it not imposed, but well presented. So I feel that it is a combination of it is something that we need to focus on more. And academics, I would feel that all Muslim academics, or Muslim or non-Muslim, those academics who are working on Muslims in the media representation, as Dr. Mohamad rightly said, that there have been a lot of literature. We can since 9/11, we can see, a huge volume of literature coming out, but there is very little engagement with the community. So academics actually need to engage with the community, and then there has to be some sort of an intersectionality, I feel, which might produce not being destructive, but more proactive contributions, I hope.
In the UK, we have the imperative to have impact. So that actually perhaps
yes,
legitimates the idea of trying to broaden outside of the academy. Dr. Mohamad, please.
There's a lot. It's just such a rich discussion. I'm trying to gather my thoughts. And both what Dr. Salman and Dr. Michael said was so interesting. I will say something quickly. So Dr. Salman is in his chapter is talking about Allahuakbar, and he knows this, and Dr. Michael knows this, and actually they both kind of alluded to it. But it's not just Allahuakbar as a symbol, but it's also other things like the Arabic language in general. It's become terrifying. I'm reminded while you were speaking, I was reminded of the story of the flying imams, which was a big news story from where I'm from, Minneapolis, about 15 years ago or so, where these 4 elderly imams, I think one was in a wheelchair, I think one was blind. I mean, these people were not, going to do harm to anyone, but they were speaking Arabic on the airplane as it was prepared to take off from Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport, and it was a huge ordeal. They were arrested, and the story was it was months of this news story, and so it's much more than that. And it's the hijab, it's the beard, it's various other forms of Islamic symbolism that are identified as problems by media organizations, by news journalists. So that's one thing. Now, Dr. Osama, you said something interesting. I think that Toni Morrison quote, and I'm familiar with it. It was in an interview, and so she was like verbalizing that. That's not a written statement, and it was very profound, and it resonates with me. And I'm thinking now about how important narratives are. Narratives are so important to not just how people see people, how non-Muslims see Muslims or Islam, or how Muslims see themselves, but they're also key to identity construction and identity development and these kinds of things. And the question that I asked during my presentation was, what are the implications of Muslims not producing their own narratives? I mean, the Muslim world is unfortunately, sadly, it's characterized by catastrophe, whether it's the product because of imperialism or authoritarianism or other things. There are a lot of problems, let's say, in Muslim majority societies. And so Muslims are constantly placed on the defensive, constantly playing defense when it comes to this, constructing narratives. Or as Dr. Salman said, they're constantly putting out fires. But the question that I'm asking now is, what would happen if Muslims were the ones, with the microphones? That's the question that I'm asking. And I think the literature would suggest the answer is quite clear, that the entire narrative would change. Muslims would no longer be playing defense. A different kind of question would be being asked, right? So I can think of practical examples. Ayman Muhyiddin got a job at MSNBC, and we saw the editorial policies, at least insofar as his programming was concerned, both on TV and on his social media. I mean, there was a huge change in MSNBC content. I'm thinking of the example of Salman al Azami when she got a job at NPR, National Public Radio, and how she was able to do stories about the Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims that NPR had probably never aired before, right? I'm looking now at my phone and I'm following pretty obsessively the stories coming out of Gaza, and it's just fascinating and striking and tragic but I'm looking at CNN, I'm looking at the New York Times, I'm looking at ABC News, the Associated Press, Reuters. You get the same version in almost every news outlet. There's a focus, an intense focus on 70 Israelis who were killed. And in almost every news story that I've clicked on, we don't get to hear anything about the Palestinians that were killed until we get 3, 4, or 5 paragraphs into the news story. And it's right now, it's like 198 Palestinians. So more Palestinians killed than Israelis. Also, many of the news outlets are running Netanyahu's quote as part of their headline, either the headline or the subheadline. And this is a recurring theme, that Israeli voices are highlighted, Palestinian voices are marginalized. We see the same thing in broader coverage of Muslims and Muslim issues. Chris Bale, and I'll close on this, I don't want to take up too much time, but Chris Bale did a fascinating study several years ago. He's a scholar at Duke, and he looked at these far-right fringe organizations in the United States. These are organizations run by people like Daniel Pipes and Frank Gaffney and Robert Emerson and others. And he looked at what happens when they put out a statement about Muslims and what happens to what sort of is the media effect. And what he found is that those statements are picked up en masse by American news outlets. On the other hand, he looked at the opposite. He looked at organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations and numerous other Muslim advocacy groups, and what happens when they put out statements, you see. And unsurprisingly, the news media aren't really interested. And there were massive disparities. It's a quantitative study. It was computerized content analysis. So he's looking at hundreds of thousands of units. So it's very robust. But narrative and narrative construction. I think Muslims, as Dr. Salman said, as Dr. Michael alluded to as well, Muslims have to take more ownership of narrative construction.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohamad. And finally, Dr. Michael Munnik, you're kind of like, your work is Muslim adjacent, obviously, because you work in the Center for Study of Islam in the UK, but you can give us something of an outsider's view of some of this as well. You've been, I'd really be fascinated by it.
And actually, to give a very direct view, and this kind of falls right on from what Dr. Mohamad was just saying, both to offer the tantalizing hope and maybe the damp squib of reality at the same time. One of the groups that I worked with doing the fieldwork for my PhD was an organization called Amna Muslim Women's Resource Center in Glasgow. And they had recently had a campaign that got a lot of really positive and we'll say relatively high traffic with news media interest in the Scottish and even maybe the UK national news media. They had a campaign called I Speak for Myself that was very visually driven, and it was really placing women's identity as Scottish, as Muslim, directly in the frame of what they were talking about, and sometimes in jokey, light ways, sometimes in serious ways. There's a visual consistency to it, and that it involved sort of an image of a woman's head, and sometimes if she was choosing to cover her face with this message, because they had a white piece of paper they were supposed to write a message on that was addressing that topic of who do you think I am, and who am I, and making claims that could be I am not a terrorist, or I like iron brew, I like fish and chips, trying to really anchor that Scottishness and anchor the Muslimness at the same time, and combat narratives. Now, this got a lot of news media interest. They had some support from groups that were offering media training for a lot of different social community groups in the area of Glasgow they were based, and they were well poised, they were well placed. It really worked for them in terms of a difference in their news contact, and following that, the question was, what do we as a group do with this sudden news media interest? So that was a positive story, the kind of things that our other panelists have asked. Why couldn't we see these kinds of things that was there? Although we might say that still that lingering undercurrent of the negativity is there, in that people felt the need to attest to their identity and their belongingness. But if that was an undercurrent, nonetheless, there was a positive element to it. And the organization was getting phone calls from journalists afterwards to comment on various stories coming up, some of them directly in their wheelhouse and some of them a little bit more stray from the area. But how they managed those relationships became interest for me in studying it. And what was especially telling for it was that when they then had a subsequent campaign they wanted to talk about, which was dealing with domestic violence, they felt they were following the rule book, as it were, all the things that succeeded the last time, things they'd learned about media dynamics generally, and incorporating those into their campaign that nonetheless landed and fell very flat and received no media interest whatsoever. And they thought, what happened? How come we didn't do anything with this? It was a campaign released in November, and there was no interest for 4 or 5 weeks. And sadly, then there was a very high-profile case of a gang sexual assault on a woman in India, which raised questions globally in that time between Christmas and New Year's, when journalists aren't telling a lot of other stories, that other things can become amplified quite significantly. And then there was an interest in this, oh, wait a sec, there's this group or that. There was a press release we saw about women in domestic violence, and a lot of them are South Asian, so they can speak about this. So they were out of the office in their support center over the Christmas shutdown and came back to the office early in January to find a whole bunch of messages from journalists asking if they could speak about this issue. And this, well, it's not exactly what our campaign was about anyway. And they weren't able to respond in the time the journalists needed it. So the mismatch, when the journalists care, they felt, expressed to me, a real inability still to control the narrative. Though they had got some privileged access, they had shown their worthiness as a source group that could deliver goods for the mainstream media. When they wanted to activate that relationship for their own purposes, it was still difficult and not definitely always within their control to make that happen. So some successes, some difficulties in that, and that's something else that I've published on. If you're curious, I can point you in the direction of those, but I'll maybe finish with that, because I think that kind of anchors at some of the things that we want to talk about, and I would want to leave space for the questions from the community.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Munnik. And this has been really sort of a very wide-ranging conversation, bringing lots of different threads together. And our audience has been remarkably patient with us. They've actually put in 8 questions. So I'm going to actually go ahead and start launching into the Q&A. And so hopefully we'll do this reasonably sort of efficiently. And some of the questions have also been addressed directly at certain individuals. So I'm going to go ahead and ask, the first question is directed to yourself, Dr. Salman, on the topic of Islamophobia. And you can broaden this out. There were 2 questions for you, so I'm going to put them both to you. One was, on the topic of Islamophobia, should there be a definition of Islamophobia? This is, of course, something dealt with in your book. And then another one is, what are the key trickle-down mechanisms to ensure spreading of the conclusions from academics, presumably to the wider community? That's a question that we spend a lot of time asking, actually. But please go ahead.
Thank you. Islamophobia definition is there. There have been many different types of definitions. We had Runnymede Trust giving definitions in 1997, then come out 20 years later, and interestingly adding the racism element. So one of the definitions that we have been using, and I've been using as well, and many academics in the UK have endorsed, including myself, I'm sure Michael probably is included in that, is the Islamophobia definition.com. And the definition is, Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. Now, this definition, of course, in the right-wing media and right-wing politicians, they have not been accepting. But interestingly, majority of the British politicians, the Muslim Council of Britain, of course, endorsed it. The all-party parliamentary group in British Muslims, they actually is part of this, and a lot of academics, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, and even Scottish Conservatives, but not the Central Tory Party, and they actually wanted to make their own definition and contacted, and also employed Qari Asim to do that. And then later on, we come to know that they did nothing about it, and he resigned from this post. So they have not yet come out with it. And the definition is very important, but The problem, they want to say that Muslims are not a race, and they come from all over the world, but what they don't understand that the Islamophobia is rooted in racism. Racism is the cause. It's about a sense of superiority and inferiority of others, which is the cause of racism. And that is why we included the concept of perceived Muslimness in it, because a lot of Sikhs have been targeted for looking like a Muslim, having beard. And that has happened a lot after 9/11 in America. And so this is why racism is not about because how Muslims look. We don't have many white Muslims or Caucasian looking Muslims, but Muslims do look like Arabs or South Asians or black. And then assuming someone is a Muslim, there can be Islamophobic attacks, or in terms of their appearance, like hijabis. And hijabi women are the most and if you are Muslim, if you are black hijabi Muslim, you are the #1 target in terms of Islamophobic attacks. So that is basically, there is a definition, and of course there is no consensus, and of course definitions generally do not necessarily have a consensus. We can see a very controlled definition of anti-Semitism, and that is very interesting. I don't want to go into that because this is something that I discuss in my lectures as well, because how the definition is constructed by the Organization of Jews, and some elements of where Israel comes into that definition is something. It seems that they're really always trying to justify that this is how Israel is there, and bringing Israel into the definition makes it more complicated. But the definition is there, and it's a more controlled definition. But Islamophobia definition, it's all right to have varied definitions. To answer the second question, I think we covered that a little, mostly that it's more about when we publish a work, and in the UK, we were encouraged to do so, that in the impact case study, that we try to see how our research is not just for the publication, not coming as in the literature, but also there is an engagement with the community. And the more that engagement can be done, the more results we can probably have. And there will be more what we call knowledge exchange between academics and the community. I hope that answered the questions.
I think that's quite comprehensive, and we can come back to those themes. I can see, Michael, you've put your hand up. Can I also ask you a question while you go ahead and add your comment? Because one of the attendees notes, Dr. Munnik, I understand you are a lecturer at Cardiff University, which is a well-established ISOC. This is maybe a bit of a practical question. Feel free to take it how you will. So how might ISOCs contribute to positive change in the media for Muslims on the ground? Actually, a very important question.
Thank you. I'll come to that in a second, but just to follow from Dr. Salman's statement about Islamophobia in particular, just to refer back to this little survey I did of the small handful of existing style guides that journalists did consult, that none of the journalistic style guides gave a real definition of Islamophobia at all, except to give sort of the spelling of it, and then it has a capital I. This is how we refer it, and some saying, well, we discourage its use, instead talking about, but very little about the issues behind it. And it was left to the discursive guides that were prepared by external organizations meant to help journalists directly with questions of Islam and Muslims to give a more dense and thorough working definition of Islamophobia. I felt for me that was telling, in that the journalists need to be waiting for someone else to make the call on how we talk about Islamophobia. And given that the discussion, as Dr. Salman notes, this goes back to 1997 and a report from the Runnymede Trust, which itself came out of discussions that had been happening for at least half a decade prior to that, that journalists have been waiting an awful long time for someone else to make a decision about how they use this term. And it might be time for them to actually just to take that one, grasp that nettle and figure out what they want to say about it. The question about ISOCs and how they can engage, it's in a way, it's the advice that I would give to any organization that is attempting to get news media coverage, which is on the one hand to study things as well as you can to understand what journalists look for in a story and how to make your message perceived and sharp in a journalistic environment, but at the same time to temper your expectations about how successful you'll be in getting their ear and steering their ship the direction you want it to travel. But every study that I've looked at in terms of this, and it's not just related to issues regarding Islam and Muslims, but other groups that want attention and feel the bad end of it, is that relationships are key. And that though journalists may not always cover your area the way you want it to be covered, that it is still worth cultivating relationships with journalists, especially if you think there are some that are, if not directly from your community, the Muslim who's working in a newsroom, but someone who is shown to be sympathetic and understanding to that, starting there and just talking with them, getting in touch, letting them know what your issues are, what you're capable of speaking about, how you might be of service to them in the future, because of that reciprocity is really important to make that relationship work. Journalists want to know that people are there to answer perhaps quickly when they have a question, and especially are willing to talk on air or on the record, which is an area where in my research, some journalists found their sources in Muslim communities to be a little bit disappointing for them, because they would speak a lot off the record about things. Then when you say, all right, here's the microphone, we're recording, can we put this? And they say, oh, no, not me. They don't want to cause disruption. Maybe worried about the implications for themselves, understandably, of being exposed in the media spotlight in that regard. And, ISOCs may have some trouble in this regard if they're seen as kind of a hotbed of radicalism or something like that, or an area of dissent against state procedures, critical of prevent agenda here in the UK. I don't know if that's something that your American participants are very familiar with, but pressures that ISOCs might be under. So to be exposed as someone speaking in the news media, it can be difficult. But where you can manage it, I would really encourage you to be that presence, to make yourself available in public and invest in relationships, because it will bear fruit and lead to some benefits.
Many thanks. I should clarify for any international listeners that ISOCs are like MSAs in the US, or basically Muslim student societies that bring together Muslim students for activism purposes on university campuses. I think there was one other point that I wanted to add to that, but it passes me by at this point. I should note it down next time. So I'm actually going to direct the next question at Dr. Mohamad Elmasry. As I say, if any of the panelists wants to comment on a question which has been directed to someone else, please feel free. But it's a slightly long question. What sort of topics, areas, or methods should we be exploring or engaging as academics, given your considerable experience, and this is directed at all of us, to work towards a future where Muslims can profess multifaceted, variegated political philosophies grounded in theology and belief systems without being subjugated to counterterrorism laws and slander, or being demonized by it uses the term Occidental influences, which is a bit sort of maybe or potentially being isolated by sort of liberal influenced media. So, I mean, this is a more general question, but Dr. Mohamad, perhaps you can give some reflections on this, inshallah.
You gave me the hard one, the hardest one.
I let you wait for a while.
Yeah, no, I'm joking. It is a really good question. It probably is above my pay grade. That's a really big and broad and deep question. I would say that, what study areas? My goodness, all of the above. Muslims, the Muslim Ummah is in such a bad shape, and I scanned the questions. I did see that there was a question about Mohammed bin Salman's recent interview on Fox News. I don't know how political we're gonna get here, but it's really a disaster in the Muslim world when you look at the leadership and the authoritarianism and Muslim leaders working actively to undermine other Muslims, especially like religious Muslims or, conservative Muslims, Muslims who have something to say about politics. I mean, you have really aggressive programs being carried out by many governments in the Muslim majority world. So Muslims are, Muslims who care about the Muslim Ummah are needed in so many areas. We need political scientists, we need journalists, media professionals, we need, what I would say is we need to do more in the areas of kind of the social sciences and humanities, politics and society. I think we probably have enough, no disrespect, but we probably have enough medical doctors and engineers, especially in the West. I mean, at some point, we have to say something about that. I mean, it's difficult, it's sensitive because it's hard. You can't tell an individual kid who's 22, don't be a doctor, don't be a medical doctor, if that's what he or she wants to be. And it's difficult also to talk down to parents. But at a societal level or at an ummah level, we have to have that conversation. Do we really need this many engineers? Do we need this many, medical doctors? And especially in the West, would we be better served in other areas? I don't know if Dr. Michael or Dr. Salman want to chime in on any of that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Michael. I think the last point that you raised, Dr. Mohamad, is goes into the family. I know by Usama is smiling. I probably, none of you know, I hope Usama, you won't mind me saying that.
Fine,
Usama was actually, in our family-wise, also everyone wanted Usama to be a doctor. He was accepted for Imperial College Medicine, but he decided not to study medicine and study Islamic studies. So in my family also, one of my daughters, my wife wanted her to study medicine. She decided to study political science. I think there is I happen to give, we have a small Muslim community in our own university, and I happen to lead the Jummah prayer there. And just yesterday in my khutbah, I was just welcoming the new students, and I was trying to tell them that, university is a place of critical discussions and challenge us. I tell them that you need to develop that ability to challenge even your lecturers. If they say something, most of them will be fine, but there are some things that you think don't, as Michael was alluding to, that when the Muslim community was asked to give interviews on record, they were reluctant. I think we have to come out of that reluctance and speak up. And the more of us that we can do, and more journalists we have, more academics we have, the more people in politics we have, and the more influence we can have. We can, sometimes we talk about other communities, though they are influencing, and we come out with, conspiracy theories about different other communities. If I always answer this question in that way, that if they are leading and they are, even if it is a conspiracy theory, if you believe in it, why don't you do it yourself? Why don't you try to influence yourself rather than blaming others? Of course they will do it. So what are we doing? We are trying to host World Cups. We are trying to spend huge amount of money in, making the tallest buildings in the world. Okay, good enough. Okay, but is that what you do as an ummah, where your ummah, look what is happening in Palestine and how it is represented all the time? When have we ever watched a TV saying Palestine under attack? When was that headline on a news media? Now you turn on BBC, turn on Sky, turn on any news channel. The big headline is Israel under attack. Okay, so that type of narrative, no one is concerned about. And again, going back to the interview and the leadership that we have in the Muslim Ummah, it is difficult. Sorry, Michael, you can.
That's all right. I think, all I'd say that it's great that you give that message to the students incoming. On the one hand, I always say it's a hard time to make that argument because the humanities and the social sciences are under enormous attack.
Yes.
In Britain, there's a narrative of the uselessness of these kinds of degrees. And even just this weekend, we've seen narratives coming out of the Conservative Party, which is the current party of government in Britain, against, was it woke politics, getting woke politics out of science. I thought, my goodness, like this, it's hard to convince people. And then when you think about all the people who would go on to maybe get degrees and get PhDs, what do they? You spend all that money on your tuition fees, and what do you get with it? You serve Big Macs at McDonald's. This is why not get something useful that's going to earn you some money? So it's hard to make that argument. But I hope that, as Dr. Mohamad was indicating, that there's a real vibrance to the field, and that it does attract people to it. And so I think the important thing for the Ummatic consciousness generally is not get in the way of that, and not dissuade people from that, but where the curiosity is there, to support that as best you can. Something else that I wanted to throw into the conversation is a concern about what we want from this, because Ummatic solidarity could lead us to a point of, if we're critical of authoritarianism, yet expecting a kind of a uniformity of a message, that can itself be a form of authoritarianism that prevents people from speaking their mind because it's seen as somewhat deleterious to preserving the unity of the Ummah. And so there needs to be a way that different voices can speak. I don't know that a demonstration of diversity and plurality in terms of political thought or attitudes and social aspects of the life that they're in is a bad thing. Where that's seen as undermining the unity of the Ummah, it can become a kind of a chill from within that prevents people from speaking. On the other hand, it does present that idea that these Muslims can't agree on anything, and so why should we pay attention to them? And that can be a challenge in and of itself. I think it is worth cultivating more voices that can speak back to it, but need to be mindful that not all of what those voices are going to speak might be satisfying for everyone's ears, and that also needs to be okay.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We have still got around 7 questions. So I'm going to ask people to kind of do quick fire. We've got about 20 minutes. And so let me start with, I'll see if I can mix up some of the questions as well. So maybe I'll read 3 questions at a time, and people can respond to whatever they think, and then we can move on. So first question, do you subscribe to the fact that the lack of unity among Muslims constitutes a recipe for media misrepresentation? I think we've touched on that in the past. A second question, are Muslim majority governments best placed to construct/correct the global perception of Muslims, or is a private sector / community-based response to be preferred? Very thoughtful question. And then third, the contributions seem to be based on a very centralized, hierarchical and asymmetrical model of media production. I'd be curious to hear the contributors on specific effects of cyber technologies and social participation in forming media silos. Thank you for your talks and your efforts in addressing this subject. So 3 rather different questions, but I'm happy for people to take what they think is.
If I take the third one, I read that question. I found it very interesting. And of course, when we are talking about these issues, we are talking about mainstream media, we're talking about news media, we're talking about broadcast media, we're talking about popular culture. But of course, people nowadays are very much within the social media area. But I personally feel that, yes, social media is very, very powerful, but social media is often influenced by the mainstream media. What happens is a reaction. We see a reaction to mainstream media and social media, and then that goes on, it spirals into lots of different types of narratives, discussions, and viewpoints. And we can't control everyone's minds, and because this is we live at an age where everyone is a broadcaster, and in that way everyone will have opinions and they will give opinions, and it is difficult to really get a uniform idea from social media. But I feel that there are lots of ways where we can, in many ways, I feel influence social media. So in that way, that if there are narratives that we bring up that social media is influenced by. And then we can see that, of course, there can be critical debate. Is very important. What Michael brought out is a very important point. And in other, that comes out in the question as well, that are you talking about a united, ummah, all talking? No, Islam, one of the most beauty of Islam is the diversity. We have 4 schools of thought in the Sunni Islam, where there are a lot of variations in the way we pray, variations with the way we, even in the recitation of the Quran, there are variations. So that is very much part. So unity in diversity. And I think, I'm sure that the Ummatic concept of is not about dictating or, having an authoritarian ideology, but what is about the global Muslim issues that, and then we'll debate, we critically discuss and try to resolve. And one of the questions is about Muslim governments. One of the least people I would trust is the Muslim governments, being a Muslim. And I have, one of the, lot of the oppressive, Muslim governments around the world, I don't want to have to name them. They are creating more problems for Muslims than the Western governments. And we are living in a Western society criticizing Western governments. We're talking about the Prime Minister, talking about the Tory government living in the UK. And in America, people can do that. But you can't do that in many Muslim countries, even just raise your voice. So yeah, I don't think Muslim governments are the solution, and as it is at the moment.
Jazakallah khairan. Does anyone else want to add to any of those questions? I think that, yeah, so otherwise I'm happy for us to expand the discussion to include other questions. And if you want to touch on the themes that came up earlier, please feel free. Does that sound good? Yes.
Yeah, could I just briefly talk about the cyber question, the diffuse away from hierarchical media, that I think we're seeing the dangers of that. There's a dream that we lived in for a good sort of 15 years, the Web 2.0, and our ability to be all speaking in that way, but we're seeing the pulling apart of that narrative. When the platforms are in the hands of people who are acting irresponsibly with it, it becomes very difficult to maintain the communities. And I don't know if that's leading on its own to a flight back to a more centralized, monopolistic media environment, but I don't know where people are going instead. I'm just not sure that these social media networks hold the same ability to deliver the promise of our ability to articulate our voice in a way that will be heard and persuasive for others as it had before. Just wanted to add that thought before we move on to other questions.
Absolutely. I mean, social media is a quite sort of atomizing force as well, which is quite a challenge unto itself. Okay, so I'm going to read another 3 questions. Does the Islamic tradition itself provide Muslims with any relevant tools / principles for public engagement or the significance of hearts and minds? This is maybe slightly beyond the kind of, I'll see if I can reflect on this myself a bit later, but I want to give you guys the floor first. And then another question, how might Muslims engage actively without presenting an inauthentic, distorted version of what it means to be Muslim? Do the panelists have any reflections on Mohammed bin Salman's recent interview with Fox News in this regard? I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, but to a certain extent, we have touched on it, and Mohammed Masri, you have as well. I'm going to read, actually, if it's okay, I'm going to read another 2 questions before we open the floor. Dr. Salman, a follow-up comment on your Islamophobia discussion. The APPG definition has been heavily criticized for lacking the spiritual element, i.e. a white Muslim man who looks nothing or is not perceived as a Muslim can be discriminated against, but under this definition, that wouldn't be classed as Islamophobia. That's, I guess, a question directed very specifically. And then finally, an open question, are you discussing, are discussions on Islamic political thought forced to inevitably become filtered, redacted, and subdued when Muslim activists speak in media? Same question, but for Muslim academics, are they filtered or limited to in what they can explore? How can we overcome this if this is indeed an obstacle? So a question on, the limitations of Islamophobia definition, a question on the self-censorship that we inevitably engage in any sort of social interaction, and if there's a social imaginary that is overwhelmingly Islamophobic, how does that, distort our understanding? And then a couple of questions on the sorts of tools that we can use and dealing with sort of distorted versions of what it means to be Muslim. Very broad range of discussions. And I'll open it up.
I would like to hear your response, Dr. Osama, on the tools question, Islamic tools.
So does the Islamic tradition provide Muslims with any relevant tools, principles for public engagement, or the significance of hearts and minds? And this is actually, I'm actually working with colleagues at the Ummatics Institute to try and, explore that. The Islamic tradition is 1400 years old. In comparison, the post-Enlightenment tradition is maybe 200-300 years old, right? And so there has been a massive production of knowledge in that period over the last 200-300 years in Europe and the Americas and so on. But when it comes to the Islamic tradition and 1400 years of reflection on these questions in vastly variegated circumstances, I think it makes a lot of sense that we actually need to explore those. So the Muslim tradition is seen as, coming out of the Quran and the Sunnah, reflecting what Muslims believe to be revelation from God, and the kind of the accompanying normative practice of the Prophet ﷺ, which is also something which the Quran itself mandates that we adhere to. And after that, there are so many interactions with very real life civilizational challenges. If Islamic civilization existed from the year roughly, 650 to roughly 1900 as a robust civilization that had global impact, and after that it has been dismantled by other powerful entities globally, there is no question that there will be extraordinary resources within it to sustain a civilizational project that can be very diverse. I mean, the Ottoman Empire presided over its imperial population contained maybe at certain points 40 to 50, less than 50% Muslim population. So managing that diversity within whether it's interreligious or intra-Muslim is something which should really be recognized as built into Islamic iterations of how to deal with this. So I do think that there will be resources. I think the major challenge that we have is this is antiquarianism for most of us. You have to go and sort of train and dredge up these sorts of things. And I think that that's something that we do need to do. But I hope that that gives something of a satisfying answer. I'm not sure it does really address the real questions underlying. And those questions would be very practical. How do we translate that into real world tools? And I hope that we can work towards that. Michael Munnik, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Just, I mean, I think you mentioned tools. It's a really great answer to offer that. Two things really came to my mind. I'm not an Islamic scholar, so please keep that in mind if I'm straying from good use of these. But the idea of isnad, of the chain of transmission, can be thought of in media terms, and not just journalistic terms, but also media consumer terms, in terms of authenticity and verification. Where do you get your information? How trustworthy is it? That there is a tool within the Islamic tradition already that exists to say, we like this source, we understand where it comes from, thinking critically about where the steps came from to arrive at a conclusion about what we think to be true or useful or necessary. So that applying those kind of concepts in saying this is not foreign for us to be skeptical and critical and rigorous in how we understand where our information comes from and what we hold on to. And related to that, I think also adab, which may be even antiquarian for our current time of thinking about our comportment and the people who are speaking and their character and how that influences what they say when we have concerns about people speaking in the media about topics. And I think that the study that you mentioned, Dr. Mohamad, about Chris Bale, is looking at the sources of information where people will flock their interest to, and we might question the character of the people who are providing the information that nonetheless is seen as very satisfying journalistically, but holding to that a good that is higher than that and a different set of qualities those are a couple of tools I see coming from within the Islamic tradition that might be helpful for people to think about their own media consumption, their media engagement.
Dr. Salman, you have your hand up, but before that, I did want to, because Dr. Mohamad Al-Masri has been a little quiet. I don't want to necessarily put you on the spot, but if you want to,
I actually did want. I'm busy trying to figure out how to raise the hand on Zoom, and I don't know how to do it. So I'm technologically incompetent, if nothing else. I wanted to say something about those. So there was a question. It's not. I don't have it in front of me, but it was about the restrictions or self-censorship, right? That Muslims face, and I think in the second part of the question that academics face. So, and you, when you were kind of reading the question, you sort of answered it, Dr. Osama. Yeah, there is inevitably a type of self-censorship. I think for everybody. I think very few people have the power to say whatever they want in any platform at any time. And I'll give you an example right now. So I live in Qatar, and obviously Al Jazeera, I'm very sympathetic to Al Jazeera in general. I actually think Al Jazeera does really good work, but I also have some critiques of Al Jazeera, and I think there are some really interesting projects to explore about how Al Jazeera editorial policy has changed after the truce with Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the Emirates. But it's probably not a good idea. I've just made nobody has told me, nobody has said anything to me, but I know the environment. I know it's probably not a good idea for me to engage in that sort of research right now. It's sensitive. But, and I think this, again, I can't underscore this enough. I think there is self-censorship for almost anybody and everybody, right? What I will say, though, is that if we think creatively, we will never tire. We will never become bored. We will never run out of ideas. Here I am doing research on exactly the kinds of things that I want to do research on. I'm doing research on the Israel-Palestine issue. I'm doing research on Islamophobia. I'm doing research on the media and terrorism. And so what I would suggest, and I think it's a great question, don't get me wrong, but what I would suggest is instead of focusing on the things that maybe, the few things that we might be restricted by, let's focus on the things that we can, engage with.
I think that's a very useful point. Another way of looking at this is a lot of issues might be beyond the realm of what's reasonable to talk about. But if we deal with lots of adjacent issues, it just highlights that issue as, wait, why is that such a gaping hole in our discourse? And people will inevitably end up talking about it as well. I mean, you talk about Al Jazeera and the way in which they've softened their line so dramatically against Saudi Arabia since the truce. But a scholar like myself, I deliberately over the last 20 years avoided Israel-Palestine as the area of my research because I didn't want to be sort of targeted as someone who's, I don't know, anti-Semitic just because I'm anti-Israeli or something like that. So, against the policies of the sort of Israeli right, which has taken over the country, basically. Yeah. So we all have to sort of be careful about that. Okay, so we have literally 5 minutes left.
I'd like to just reply to the question that was addressed to me and briefly talk about this topic as well, but mainly, when I was talking about definition, I was saying that, you don't have a uniform definition there to cover everything, but there is an element of when we talk about, that's the question, when you talk about Islamophobia, we are not talking about theology, we're not talking about practicing Islam, we're talking about Muslims who are facing discrimination or attacks or abuse because of their Muslimness, and that covers white Muslims or revert brothers and sisters who also face that. So the Muslimness element does cover it, but very interestingly, when you talk about racism, when someone, a white person becomes Muslims, they are no longer whites. So that element of they lose their whiteness or their Caucasianness or whatever, and they are immediately come that, and that is something I heard from people like, Lauren Booth, that I am looked at no longer as a white person because I wear the hijab and I am Muslim, so I have lost that element of my whiteness. So that's why I'm subject to Islamophobia as well. So that is very interesting. There is an interesting element in it. And the second point, I'll just briefly support what Dr. Mohamad was saying about the work we do. There is, of course, academic freedom that we do have. And interestingly, a few years ago, I had a scholar from Eritrea coming and working with me in my university as a refugee academic who wrote a book on language planning in Eritrea. For that, he had to flee the country. So you can easily understand that living in the West, one of the good things we have, yes, we do self-censorship to a large extent, but we also have a lot of academic freedom. No one stopped me from doing the book that we have been doing and you've been involved in. So we do have academic freedom. And I recently have a PhD student enrolled in working on jihad, and it's the word jihad, how the media represents of jihad and its implication on Muslims in Birmingham. So there are a lot of academic freedom. So we can be creative and we can do whatever we can do within time.
Can I perhaps, I mean, we've got another 3 minutes or so, but, or 2 minutes. Let me just perhaps also add a reflection on the question of self-censorship. Human beings are social animals. Social interaction requires self-censorship of certain kinds. Like, if I get upset with my son or my wife and, I just let loose all of the emotions completely unfiltered towards them, I wouldn't have very much of a social life that would be meaningful. The problem that we're dealing with here is the sort of insidious censorship that is being imposed by malicious power structures to perpetuate certain types of oppression. And there's no question that that exists in all systems globally, but it's just so naked in so many parts of the Muslim world, unfortunately. In our part of the world where we're living in the West, or have been educated in the West, we recognize it's a lot more polite. It will still destroy your career, but it will be done, without you being tortured in a dungeon somewhere. And I think that places an enormous responsibility on those of us who have that privilege to not be suppressed. And in addition, the idea of academic freedom, I think, is extremely important, that it's articulated explicitly. This is something which is presupposed in the Islamic scholarly tradition. People dealt with all sorts of heterodox ideas in their sort of writings, and they wrestled with them very seriously. But it's been forgotten, unfortunately, in our own times by these, not universally, of course, but by a lot of authoritarian states. And it's in that spirit that I perhaps want to bring us back to the question of the role of the media, because in our parts of the world, in many parts of the Muslim world, the media is used as a tool by authoritarian states to maintain their grip on power and, in effect, brainwash other peoples. And I think what we're encouraging all of our listeners to do is think critically about that, think critically about the role that you can play in sort of contributing to what exists in media, the potential sort of decentering of legacy media, and perhaps, for us to recognize that as well as being scholars who are critically analyzing, that we can play a role that is more impactful in trying to contribute to encouraging others to think critically in this way, and letting our scholarship speak to those concerns very directly. And I think all of the scholars on the panel have been, invited to speak on this topic precisely because this is what you do. So I close by really thanking you all for a wonderfully insightful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your sharing, Osama.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
All right.
Assalamu alaikum.
We'll see each other.